Hello again. We're going to continue on here with the second video lecture from Chapter 1, Microbes in the Planet, and there is a corresponding section of your textbook for this topic, so I'm just going to I'm going to hit some of the highlights here. This is a diagram from your textbook which is kind of giving you a timeline for the current thinking among biologists about when different types of life forms first appeared on the planet. So this is the evolutionary history. So biologists have determined that all of the living things that currently exist on our planet today, including us, have way deep back in the past. We have a common ancestor from which all living things on the planet evolved. And so that took a very long period of time, billions of years. That's a time period that's very difficult for the human mind to process. And so it can be very difficult to comprehend how in the world this evolutionary process led to the development of all of these life forms we have on the planet. And it is pretty hard to think about, but you have to consider the very long periods of time that have been involved for this to take place. And so why do we think that? There's quite a bit of fossil evidence to put that story together. But today, especially within the last 10 years or so, we are accumulating a lot of genetic evidence. So we can take the DNA out of any living organism and determine the genetic recipe books, the genetic recipes for any living thing today pretty quickly. In fact, many of you, probably not too far down the road, will have your DNA sequence determined, your DNA genetic code read, and that'll probably eventually become part of our medical records not too far down the road, as science fiction-y as that may sound. And so since living things inherit their DNA from their parents, and parents inherited from their parents and so forth and so on, DNA is passed along from our ancestors. And so when we look at the DNA of the living things that exist on the planet today, we can compare the DNA from one living thing to another using computer databases and so forth, and we can see relationships and figure out, how far back in time did our family trees actually split. So, and that's kind of in a nutshell. We don't have a lot of time in this class to go into any details on that, and you can do some additional reading in your textbook. But again, as I mentioned on the last video lecture, the probable origin of the planet Earth is over 4 billion years ago, about 4.5 billion years ago. Then about 3.7 billion years ago, these are when the first bacterial type organisms formed. And notice they're labeled there as prokaryotes. And then a little less than 2 billion years ago, we have organisms that are labeled as eukaryotes that came on the scene. And so we'll talk about prokaryotes versus eukaryotes in this class. If you've had a biology class in the past, you no doubt talked about prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. They refer to cell types. And your prokaryotes include bacteria and the archaea. They're single-celled, and they consist of prokaryotic type cells. There are two major cell types. Eukaryotes include a very diverse array of organisms. Eukaryotic cells are generally larger and more complex. They evolved on the planet later, and there are examples of those that are single-celled organisms. There are single-celled eukaryotes. But then any of the organisms that you see with the naked eye fall into this category. So plants, fungi, animals, any of those types of organisms fall into the eukaryotic category. So your more complex multicellular organisms are going to fall into the eukaryotic type category. Okay, so those were the first eukaryotes less than 2 billion years ago were also single-celled organisms. Remember how we talked about the microorganisms had the planet to themselves for a very long time. And then here's present time over here. So even things like insects, on the long timeline of the Earth, they haven't really been here all that long when you consider the entire time frame for the Earth, but we're still talking about hundreds of millions of years. Here's reptiles, including the dinosaurs there that are now extinct. Really wasn't all that long ago on the whole timeline of the Earth that they were here. Mammals, we're mammals as well, really haven't been here for very long on the whole timeline of the Earth. It's a few 100 million years. And here we are, humans. Notice we don't even get a colored bar on the diagram. We really have not been here all that long. Modern humans, just a few tens of thousands of years on the planet Earth. This is kind of giving you an overview. And again, evolution, you always talk about evolution in a biology class. What does that mean? Changes in living things that occur over time. And what does this process do? It allows, we've got this big, large planet. There are lots of different environments on the planet. Hot, cold, wet, dry, salty conditions, low pH, high pH, no oxygen, lots of oxygen, many different environments. And these evolutionary processes that allow living things to change over time permit these living things to develop new adaptations. They adapt to new environments where they couldn't exist before. And if an organism becomes adapted to an environment and is successful there, it will kind of occupy that space and become a member of the community in that particular environment. So evolution has allowed living things to adapt across all environments on the planet. What drives it? There's a process called natural selection, sometimes called survival of the fittest. And what selection means is the fittest are going to survive. If a living thing is more likely to reproduce, it has developed some sort of advantages that make it more likely it can survive long enough to reproduce and pass its DNA down along to its offspring, then eventually it is going to multiply and become the predominant member of its species, or over time it may evolve into a new type of living species. This is driven by genetic mutations, changes in the DNA that often occur randomly. We know that DNA changes randomly, and that drives this type of process. You have some kind of genetic change. Genes lead to your traits that you have. If you get some new trait, say that makes you're a plant, and you've had a mutation that makes it more likely you're going to survive during drought conditions, that might allow you now to become a species in a different environment where you lived before. And we'll talk quite a bit about natural selection in this class, because microorganisms evolve very, very quickly. They multiply quickly, they genetically change very quickly, and from a healthcare standpoint, that creates problems for us. Like the flu vaccine. Why do you have to get a new flu shot every year? It's because the influenza virus evolves very quickly. We're hearing all the time now about bacteria that are becoming resistant to the antibiotic drugs that we have taken for many decades. And that's evolution, natural selection, that's driving those processes. So this evolution process really kind of underlies everything that goes on in biology, and on a smaller, shorter term scale, it's really, really important to microbiology. All right, and the process of evolution, the overall idea behind that is called the theory of evolution. I don't want to get into this argument about the word theory in our class. I do want to, because a lot of times people who have problems accepting the theory of evolution, often for religious reasons, will point out, well, evolution is just a theory. But in science, a theory, the word theory, refers to a scientific explanation that is very well documented. There's a lot of experimental evidence and data backing it up. So theory in science does not mean like theory I'm having a casual, everyday opinion. And since the theory of evolution is a important topic in biology, and it tends to be kind of a hot topic, I probably will post something over on the discussion board where we can discuss it further. I always like to discuss with my students their opinions and feelings on that particular topic. All right, so back to microbes in the planet here. As I've already said, they're present in all ecosystems. So an ecosystem can be something like a desert or a swamp, or place with very high temperatures and lots of toxic gases in it. Microbes have been discovered in almost every possible environment. Another important thing that their microbes do is a process called photosynthesis. There are certain microbes that do this process. Now, when you've learned about this before, it no doubt was involved plants. Plants are able to harness energy from sunlight, and then they take carbon dioxide in from the atmosphere. You know, the CO2 is part of our atmosphere, carbon dioxide. And they use the CO2 as like starting building blocks, and they use energy from the sun, and they're able to convert carbon dioxide to things like sugars, which they're showing you over here. And also your amino acids and your lipids and your nucleotides, all these organic molecule building blocks you learn about in any biology class. Photosynthesizers are able to make those things themselves. You got to have energy to make all that stuff, and they get that energy from sunlight. And another important thing about photosynthesis, gives off O2, oxygen gas, to the atmosphere. So organisms like us, and even many microorganisms that must have oxygen gas to survive. Now, not all microbes do, as we'll learn about later in the semester, but many of them are like us, and they've got to have oxygen gas to be able to live. You know, where is that oxygen gas coming from? It's coming from these organisms that do photosynthesis. So you, as a kid, you learn that plants do that, and they absolutely do. So do algae. They do that as well. But as it turns out, microorganisms perform about 70% of the photosynthesis on the planet. So if they weren't here, we wouldn't have enough oxygen gas in our atmosphere to support living things like us that require oxygen gas. Some other things that microorganisms do on the planet, there are various gases that are released by microorganisms, including oxygen gas. They have very diverse metabolisms. Metabolism includes chemical reactions that break things down or build new molecules, and lots of diversity. They're responsible for making many substances and breaking things down, even things that might be toxic to us. They're responsible for soil formation. Good, healthy soil includes leftover broken down components from plants and other living things that have died, and microorganisms are very involved in those processes. Mineral weathering, erosion, and so forth, microbes can be involved in those processes as well. And we'll be talking about how microbes live in close association with other living things, including us, and not always in a harmful way. In fact, the more we study them, the more we realize that many of them are living in beneficial relationships with us. And so in the next video lecture, we'll begin to talk a little bit more about what are some of these different ways that these microscopic organisms interact with us.